The nurse's voice was low, barely above the hum of the fluorescent light in the room. "Sir, someone reduced your dosage again," she said, glancing quickly at my son, who was sitting on the edge of the bed, waiting for my reaction. I froze mid-breath, the small plastic cup in my hand tilting slightly, liquid sloshing against its rim. The words were calm, measured, but the implication hit with cold precision. My eyes followed her hands, neat and deliberate, and I realized that something in my own care, something meant to sustain me, had been quietly altered. I set the cup down on the nightstand, letting the slight clink echo in the small room. My heart rate didn't spike, not in panic, but in that slow, heavy awareness that something familiar had become dangerous. The sheet rustled beneath me as I shifted my weight, noticing how precise the change had been, almost surgical in its subtlety. It wasn't an accident, not with the way the medication had been measured before, and not with the pattern repeating over the past week. Someone had decided I would not receive the full dose. My son leaned forward slightly, watching me carefully. His expression was measured, but his hands fidgeted, resting on his knees as if he were holding back both words and judgment. I could tell he knew more than he let on, or at least sensed the implications, but he remained silent. The weight of observation pressed against me. This was no longer simply about medication. It was about control, authority, and trust within the walls of my own household. The nurse's quiet words had drawn a line I could not ignore. I scanned the room, noting the clock on the wall, the small stack of pill organizers, the ambient hum of the oxygen machine in the corner. Everything seemed ordinary, but each object carried a new meaning. The dispenser was aligned differently than usual, the pills in neat rows but fewer than I expected. I touched the labels lightly, comparing them with my recollection, each verification underscoring the deliberate nature of the reduction. This wasn't negligence. It was intentional, precise, and calculated. The nurse avoided my gaze, focusing instead on a notebook she held, scribbling small notes as though recording the exchange. Her presence was professional, but her eyes flicked toward my son repeatedly, an unspoken communication passing between them. I felt the tension sharpen, the quiet recognition that someone else had orchestrated these adjustments. It was a silent warning layered beneath polite words, a signal that my well-being was being negotiated without my input. I exhaled slowly, letting the air fill my lungs deliberately. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and the cold tang of evening air through the slightly cracked window. Each sensory detail anchored me in the moment, preventing panic, while my mind raced through the implications. Someone close to me, someone trusted implicitly, had chosen to alter my care for reasons I had yet to fully understand. My eyes met my son's for a brief second. There was no malice in his expression, only the cautious restraint of someone caught between family loyalty and the obvious truth before him. I felt the weight of the house, the routines, the people who moved through it, and the potential for continued manipulation. I set my hands firmly on the bedrail, steadying myself. The danger was immediate, and it had come from within the walls I had trusted most. Moving into my son's house had seemed practical after the hospital stay. I needed support, stability, and a familiar environment while I recovered from the surgery. At first, everything appeared ordinary: quiet rooms, neatly arranged furniture, and a routine that mimicked normal life. But subtle things began to prick at my awareness. The way my son deferred to the nurse without question, the clipped tones she used when addressing me, the small insistences about timing and procedure that weren't strictly necessary. I remembered the mornings when my pills were late or the water in the kitchen had been set unusually cold. At first, I chalked it up to oversight or the chaos of a household trying to accommodate an older adult. But the repetitions became harder to dismiss. A morning cup of tea might appear late, a dose reduced by a fraction here, an explanation for a missed appointment there. Each incident by itself seemed minor, almost accidental, yet together they began to form a pattern that I couldn't ignore. The household had its rhythms, but I noticed the dynamics beneath the surface. My son often hesitated before speaking, measuring his words carefully as though to avoid upsetting the nurse or a sibling. The nurse moved with efficiency, but also a subtle assertion of authority, directing small actions and checking the room with a watchful eye. It was nothing overt, but the coordination and the unspoken hierarchy made me aware of who truly managed the routines in the house. I tried to reconcile these observations with reason. Perhaps it was merely efficiency or habit, but a sense of unease had started to settle over me. The nurse's careful phrasing, the consistent deferral by my son, and the repeated minor deviations from my expected schedule hinted at something I didn't want to acknowledge. Was it possible that these small inconveniences and alterations were intentional? The thought made my chest tighten slightly. Even the smallest interactions began to feel weighted. A casual suggestion about resting in the afternoon was phrased in a way that seemed to limit my autonomy, as if someone was testing my willingness to comply. The temperature of the room, the timing of meals, and even the subtle rearrangement of my personal items all contributed to a creeping suspicion. It wasn't a dramatic act, it was careful, subtle, and controlled. I recalled previous hospital stays and family visits where minor oversights never carried this feeling. The combination of my son's deference, the nurse's clipped authority, and the pattern of altered routines painted a picture that was difficult to ignore. Each incident alone was easily dismissed, but together they implied calculation and awareness. Sitting in the quiet of the living room, I felt the first true weight of doubt. The environment I had entered for recovery and support now carried an undercurrent of scrutiny and control. The subtle inconsistencies were no longer simply annoyances. They were signals that someone was shaping my life without my consent. The unease was deliberate, and I could feel it pressing steadily against my awareness. What had seemed like care now demanded vigilance, and I began to understand that trust in this house might not be as safe as I had believed. I opened the pill organizer on the kitchen counter and froze for a moment, noting the uneven spacing of the tablets. A few were smaller than they should have been, and one compartment contained fewer pills than the prescription dictated. I checked the printed schedule taped to the fridge and compared it with the organizer. The discrepancy was subtle, easy to miss, but deliberate. The reduction wasn't dramatic, but the pattern had repeated enough times that it no longer felt like oversight. Over the past week, I had started noticing slight shifts elsewhere. The water heater was turned down lower than usual in the mornings, making the shower uncomfortably cold. The thermostat in my room occasionally dropped without explanation, and the nurse would offer clipped, casual reasons. It resets on its own, or you didn't adjust it properly. The words were meant to soothe, but the timing and repetition suggested something else entirely, a subtle manipulation of my environment meant to unsettle. I began tracking the patterns mentally, noting the times and conditions under which the changes occurred. The reductions in medication always coincided with the nurse's shifts, the altered water temperatures followed a precise schedule, and even small adjustments to my blankets and personal items seemed intentional. It was methodical, like a silent experiment to see how I would react. One evening I overheard my son and the nurse speaking in the hallway, their voices low enough that I had to strain to hear. "He won't notice the change tonight," my son whispered. The nurse responded with a brief affirmation, and I caught a faint edge of amusement in her tone. It wasn't overtly cruel, but the casual way they discussed me, as though I weren't present or aware, made the room feel heavier, the air charged with quiet malice. I reviewed my notes from the previous days, checking pill counts against the printed schedule and observing when water and heating adjustments occurred. The alignment was precise, every deviation had a reason and a time, each one documented in my mental ledger. No errors were random, everything fit into a pattern. This realization created a tightening sensation in my chest, not panic, but a sharp awareness of control being exercised over me without my consent. The manipulations were subtle enough to appear innocent at first glance, but once connected, they formed a coherent pattern of oversight and restriction. The realization that these small, seemingly minor interventions were deliberate made the stakes feel higher. It was no longer a matter of inconvenience. It was a controlled environment, each small detail designed to limit my autonomy. I sat quietly for a moment, observing the nurse move efficiently through her duties, noting how she adjusted the tray of medications with precise hands, timing each action. The mechanical care was deliberate, the intention embedded beneath professional motions. Every shift, every small deviation confirmed the growing truth: I was being managed, measured, and controlled. Subtle, methodical, intentional, this was no oversight. Every adjustment, every altered routine, every hushed conversation formed a web of control, and I realized I could not ignore it any longer. I sat at the small table in my room, opening each pill bottle one by one, comparing the contents to the printed prescriptions taped to the refrigerator. The discrepancies were subtle: one bottle slightly lighter than expected, another with tablets unevenly spaced. I cross-checked the pharmacy records I had requested a week earlier, confirming that the amounts dispensed did not match what I found in the house. Each mismatch reinforced the pattern I had begun to suspect, and the quiet precision of it sent a cold awareness through me. Next, I reviewed the medical charts left by the nurse, noting the handwritten logs recording my daily doses. Times were listed, amounts recorded, but small deviations were apparent. Some entries omitted a half dose, others recorded an amount I knew I had never received. These alterations weren't random errors, they were deliberate and consistent, coordinated across multiple sources. The repetition suggested careful planning, and the thought settled into me without dramatics, only a measured recognition of danger. As I worked, I noticed the nurse observing me from the doorway, her movements subtle, controlled. She straightened a tray of medications, glanced briefly at my hands, then returned to her tasks. There was nothing overt in her behavior, no raised voice, no accusation, but the tension was present, quiet and precise, a reminder that my actions were being watched. It reinforced the need for careful documentation, for controlled observation. I traced back through prior weeks in my mind, recalling every small irregularity: missing pills, altered schedules, changes in room temperature coinciding with certain times of day. Each past incident now fit the emerging pattern of intentional oversight. I began recording everything systematically, taking photos of bottles, noting timestamps in my journal, and writing down the nurse's subtle behaviors. The process felt meticulous, necessary, and methodical, a form of armor against uncertainty. I checked the logs against the actual pill counts, taking notes on each mismatch. Even minor reductions, half a pill here, a missing dose there, were significant when viewed as a consistent practice. I labeled each photograph with the exact date, time, and discrepancy observed, building a record that could not be easily dismissed. The weight of evidence grew steadily in front of me, forming a clear map of manipulation that I could rely on without conjecture. The act of documenting brought a measure of calm. By observing and recording, I regained some control over a situation that had been quietly controlling me. The patterns were no longer abstract, they were tangible, concrete, and undeniable. Each step I took in organizing the evidence strengthened my understanding of the environment I had entered and the people orchestrating it. By the time I placed the last photo in the folder, the picture was complete. The deviations, the adjustments, the watching eyes all aligned to show deliberate control. This wasn't negligence. It wasn't mistake. It was calculated and consistent. I leaned back in my chair, taking a steadying breath. The evidence was solid, and I was ready to act, cautiously and deliberately, on the truth it revealed. I opened the medication chart again, this time tracing each line with a slower, sharper focus. The handwriting shifted subtly across the pages, one style neat and measured, the other slightly slanted and rushed. My prescription logs from the hospital sat beside it, and when I held them up together, the difference in signatures became impossible to ignore. One was mine, clean and consistent. The other, placed on days I remembered being too groggy to sign anything, carried a shape close to my handwriting but not close enough. Someone had been signing for me. I turned to the dosage columns and drew a narrow red line down the entries. The pattern revealed itself in a way that felt calculated, reductions appearing specifically on the evenings when my son was home early or when the night nurse worked the late shift. The doses didn't diminish at random. They dropped on a schedule tied directly to their presence. Seeing the alignment made my skin tighten. It wasn't a matter of disorganization or poor record-keeping. This was deliberate, synchronized, and planned. I picked up one of the pill bottles I had photographed earlier. The cap clicked as I opened it, and the sound echoed in the quiet room. As I poured the tablets into my palm, I felt an immediate shift in my chest. The count matched my suspicion exactly, reduced by the same small amount documented in the altered notes. The consistency was too clean to be accident. My heartbeat stayed steady, but a cold understanding settled in its place. Someone was controlling my medication intake. Setting the pills aside, I examined the medical notes left in the folder near my bedside. One entry claimed I had refused a dose I distinctly remembered taking. Another listed a reduction, per verbal instruction, though no conversation like that had ever occurred. The lies were woven into official records, tightening their hold on what others might believe about my care. Each forged explanation felt like another step taken without my consent, a quiet reshaping of my health that could have serious consequences. I sat back, letting the weight of the truth settle. This wasn't neglect disguised as error. It was a targeted manipulation of my treatment, hidden behind professional language and familiar faces. The emotional hit came not in a burst, but in a steady, sharp realization someone close to me had made decisions about my body without my knowledge, altering the medication that kept me stable. It was betrayal carried out in measured drops, half pills, and forged signatures. My mind moved to the potential consequences. Lower doses could make my recovery stall or reverse. Delays could weaken me. Missteps could become emergencies. The danger wasn't abstract. It lived in the pills I swallowed each day. The stakes had risen far beyond discomfort or suspicion. My well-being and possibly my survival had been placed quietly in someone else's hands. I closed the folder, forcing myself to breathe evenly. The evidence was clear, and the intent behind it no longer hid in shadows or half-explanations. Someone had crossed a line, and now I understood exactly how far they had gone. I brought the folder with me to the clinic, keeping it tucked under my arm as though it were something fragile. The waiting room felt colder than usual, the hum of the air vents steady but sharp against my nerves. When the doctor finally called me in, I laid everything out on the small desk between us. Pill bottles, printed logs, photographs of altered notes. He adjusted his glasses and began examining each item with the same quiet precision I had used when gathering them. He compared the handwritten entries to the electronic prescription records on his screen. His brow tightened. Without dramatics or hesitation, he pointed to specific reductions that were never authorized. He clicked through my dosage history, highlighting the exact days when the medication should have remained unchanged. The deviations were clear, time-stamped, and documented. These reductions weren't approved, he said in a calm but clipped voice. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact, and that made it heavier. Next, he called the pharmacy while I listened to the muted conversation through the phone's receiver. They confirmed the amounts dispensed. No adjustments, no errors. The pills had been provided in full. The discrepancy, then, existed only within the walls of my son's house. The doctor placed the phone down gently and turned the screen toward me, showing the digital records aligned perfectly with the pharmacy's confirmation. The implication landed like a steady weight. The altered doses originated at home, not here. He pulled up a chart showing expected outcomes with proper dosage versus the subtle yet dangerous effects of long-term reduction. His explanation was simple, procedural, and concise. Even small, repeated changes could weaken my recovery, lower my stability, and put me at risk for complications. "This isn't a mistake," he said, tapping the mismatched entries. "This is intentional manipulation. It endangers your health." His tone remained even, but the clarity of his words settled deep. This wasn't suspicion anymore. It was proof. I watched the charts and logs line up with ruthless consistency. The same days, the same amounts, the same pattern I had tracked on my own. Seeing it confirmed by someone trained, someone objective, stripped away any remaining hesitation. The structure of the manipulation became undeniable, connected by data instead of instinct. The danger was real, concrete, and immediate. The doctor leaned back slightly and spoke in a measured tone. "You need to protect yourself," he said. "This pattern won't stop unless it's addressed." He didn't offer dramatic solutions or promises. He simply printed the verified logs, signed them, and handed them to me with quiet finality. The papers were warm from the printer, the ink sharp and fresh, another piece of evidence to add to the growing collection. I placed everything carefully back into the folder. The room felt smaller now, the fluorescent lights harsher, but my mind cleared with a new sense of purpose. The threat wasn't imagined or exaggerated. It had been validated through records, timestamps, and expert review. I tightened my grip on the folder as I stood. It was time to protect myself. Not later, not cautiously, but now, with full awareness of the danger inside my own home. I returned home with the folder secured under my arm, its contents stacked precisely, charts, logs, photographs, and recordings neatly organized. I spread everything across the kitchen table, aligning each document with its corresponding timestamp. The visual weight of the evidence made the room feel heavier, as if the proof itself carried its own presence. Handling it systematically gave me a controlled focus, a small measure of command over the chaos that had quietly encroached on my life. My son lingered nearby, his posture subtly tense. He avoided direct eye contact, shifting from foot to foot as though aware that I had begun to piece together the full picture. The nurse hovered in the hallway, her movements clipped, precise, each glance toward me carrying a faint edge of hostility. Neither spoke, yet the room pulsed with a quiet, simmering awareness. Their restraint did not lessen the tension, it amplified it, signaling that they sensed scrutiny without fully revealing it. I began to prepare for the possibility that confrontation would be necessary. I gathered my essentials, spare keys, a fully charged phone, the folder with all evidence and documents detailing my medical history and pharmacy records. I placed them in a bag I could reach quickly if circumstances escalated. Each action was deliberate, methodical, a preparation not born of panic but of calculated readiness. Every item had a purpose, and their arrangement mirrored my logical approach to the problem at hand. A minor clash occurred while I organized the kitchen counter. A cup was left slightly out of place, and the nurse snapped at my son over it, her voice sharp yet controlled. I observed silently, noting how small provocations were used to gauge reactions, testing the boundaries of authority and obedience. The interaction confirmed the tension I had sensed. Its subtle power plays were already unfolding, and I was a participant whether I moved or stayed still. I reviewed the notes and recordings in the folder again, checking alignment with previous incidents. Each discrepancy, each alteration, and each manipulated environment was mapped with precision. Seeing the patterns consolidated into tangible proof strengthened my resolve. I didn't feel fear in the dramatic sense. I felt the cold clarity that comes from recognizing a threat, analyzing it, and planning a measured response. My eyes swept over the room one last time. Family dynamics were now transparent in a way they hadn't been before, my son torn between loyalty and realization, the nurse asserting quiet control, and the atmosphere heavy with unspoken conflict. I understood the stakes and recognized the points where I could act decisively. The preparation was mental as much as physical, a fortification of observation, strategy, and timing. I closed the folder, took a steady breath, and stood upright. Each piece of evidence, every observation, and every carefully plotted step had brought me to this point. I was no longer merely aware of manipulation, I was ready to address it directly. The confrontation was inevitable, and I would meet it with clarity, precision, and resolve. I waited until the night nurse returned with her clipboard, the office quiet except for the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. I placed the folder in the center of the table between us, opening it slowly so the charts, logs, and photographs were visible to everyone. My son sat on the edge of the chair, his hands folded tightly, glancing at the papers but not daring to speak. I met his gaze briefly and then turned my attention to the nurse. "These records show the discrepancies," I said evenly, pointing to the dates and times where my dosages had been reduced. "The prescriptions on file, the pharmacy logs, and the documentation here, they don't match what I received at home." My voice was calm, measured, but carried the weight of certainty. The nurse's eyes flicked to the timestamps, her fingers tightening around the clipboard. He swallowed and tried a light tone. "It must be a mistake," he said quickly. "I probably wrote it down wrong, or the instructions got mixed up." The explanation sounded rehearsed, but the evidence laid out before him allowed no room for casual dismissal. I didn't respond immediately, letting the weight of the folder speak for itself. The nurse's gaze darted to the folder, then to my son, and back to me. I just followed the schedule," she stammered, her voice low and clipped. "I didn't alter anything intentionally." Her words were rapid, almost defensive, but the alignment of logs, pharmacy confirmations, and my documentation showed otherwise. The pattern was too precise to be accidental. The authority present, a hospital administrator called to observe the verification, spoke quietly but firmly. "The documentation confirms intentional alteration. The deviations are consistent, coordinated, and cannot be attributed to error." The statement landed in the room with calm clarity, heavier than any raised voice could have made it. My son's face tightened, a flicker of guilt crossing his features as he realized the scope of deception had extended beyond casual oversight. I pointed again to the aligned charts. "This wasn't negligence," I said. "It was deliberate, systematic, and designed to manipulate my care. The timing, the reduced doses, the altered notes, all of it corresponds to periods when both of you had control over my medications." The air in the room grew taut, charged with the quiet recognition of betrayal. My son opened his mouth, then closed it, struggling for words. The nurse's hands shook slightly on the clipboard, her calm facade cracking as the authorities' confirmation reinforced the truth. Everyone could see the evidence, and it was undeniable. Manipulation, deliberate and sustained, had occurred under their watch. I leaned back slightly, maintaining measured composure. There was no need to raise my voice, no need for dramatics. The truth itself carried the weight, exposing the deception that had been quietly orchestrated over weeks. The room, heavy with realization, reflected the clarity of fact over fiction. The deception was laid bare, the manipulation confirmed, and the quiet, controlled tension in the air marked the exact moment the truth became unavoidable. The following morning, the hospital administrator returned with a stack of official forms and letters, laying them carefully on the desk between us. Each document carried the weight of authority reports detailing the verified reductions in my medication, corroborated by pharmacy logs, medical charts, and my own notes. The deviations were formally classified as intentional misconduct, a serious breach of protocol that could not be ignored. The language was precise and procedural, devoid of dramatics, but the impact was unmistakable. I watched as the administrator explained the steps being taken. My son and the night nurse would no longer have unsupervised authority over my medications or any decisions regarding my care. All future doses were to be managed under direct oversight, with verification from multiple independent staff. The measures were methodical, ensuring that the chain of command could no longer be bypassed. Each restriction was a quiet but firm assertion of my right to safety. My son stood silently nearby, shifting from foot to foot, his face tight with a mix of shock and remorse. He had trusted the nurse's assurances, believed in his own casual oversight, and now faced the full clarity of what had been done under his roof. The recognition of betrayal weighed heavily in his posture, the subtle tension in his hands, the silence that stretched across the room. No words could undo the missteps, and he knew it. The nurse kept her head down, gripping the clipboard tightly. Her attempts at explanation had been recorded and cataloged, leaving little room for defense. The formal classification of misconduct left her role changed, her authority restricted, and her ability to influence my care removed entirely. The procedural enforcement was unemotional but absolute. I would no longer be exposed to the manipulations that had been allowed to continue unnoticed. I gathered my folder and personal items, preparing to move to a monitored apartment provided through the hospital's senior support program. The space was secure, observed, and designed to allow me routine and independence without interference. The transition was quiet, measured, and deliberate. I didn't feel relief in the theatrical sense, only the steady awareness that I had removed myself from the immediate sphere of control and regained a measure of safety. Sitting in the new environment, I traced my steps from the previous weeks in my mind. Each altered dosage, each subtle manipulation, each overlooked discrepancy had contributed to a pattern of control that was now documented and corrected. The reality of betrayal remained heavy, but the procedural resolution gave me clarity. I could now observe, plan, and maintain autonomy without relying solely on memory or intuition. The house I had trusted no longer held sway over my well-being. The evidence had been cataloged. The authorities had acted. And for the first time since the manipulations began, I could settle into routines without the fear of unseen interference. The weight of betrayal lingered, but so did the reassurance of oversight. Justice had been executed in quiet, measured steps, leaving clarity where there had been deception. The apartment was quiet, organized, and predictable in ways that felt deliberate, not empty. I moved through my routines with a careful precision, measuring out medications, arranging daily essentials, and setting reminders for appointments. Each act, though ordinary, carried a sense of regained control. The faucet delivered water at the expected temperature. The pill organizer matched the official schedule, and the locks responded predictably. In the stillness, I realized that independence was not about freedom from routine. It was about ensuring the environment itself could be trusted. I thought back to the subtle manipulations that had gone unnoticed for weeks, the slightly reduced doses, the altered charts, the whispered instructions between son and nurse. At the time, they had seemed minor, even inconsequential, but the pattern had been deliberate. Small acts repeated over time could shape outcomes without drawing attention. Awareness, I understood, was the first defense. Observing, noting, and verifying details was not paranoia. It was a necessary practice for anyone reliant on others for health or safety. My reflection turned practical. Seniors must monitor their medications, question inconsistencies, and track changes over time. A missing dose, a slightly altered schedule, or a casual comment that doesn't add up can be the first indicators of manipulation. Trust should never be assumed, even in familiar hands. I had learned that vulnerability does not come with age alone. It comes from allowing others to act unchecked under the guise of care. The honesty and intervention of the authorities had been a quiet but critical support. Their procedural confirmation of the alterations and the removal of oversight from those who misused it had restored safety without dramatics. I didn't rely on their presence for protection. Their verification allowed me to act rationally, to rebuild routines and regain control over my life. The calm authority of fact outweighed fear more than any emotional reassurance could. I arranged the folder of evidence neatly on the shelf beside the desk, each page a record of vigilance and diligence. I didn't dwell on anger or betrayal. I noted facts, reinforced procedures, and moved forward. My routines had become a shield, a structured environment where I could live with certainty rather than suspicion. Every measurement, every timing, and every observation was part of maintaining autonomy. Sitting quietly in the evening, I felt the steadiness of regained agency. The lessons of the past weeks were clear. Subtle actions often reveal intent, small deviations matter, and trust must be earned and monitored continuously. Protection comes not from assuming goodwill, but from observing patterns, questioning inconsistencies, and documenting reality. Growing older hadn't caused vulnerability, misplaced trust had. Awareness, preparation, and documentation were the tools of self-preservation, and peace came not from forgetting what had occurred, but from ensuring it could never happen unchecked again.